Okay, so going along with that, a lot of people, people have this vague notion of what the gold standard was, but they don't. A lot of people don't realize that it is a relatively recent phenomenon that people just use what's called fiat money. All right, so this bottom right-hand picture here is a picture of a $100 trillion Zimbabwe note. So I'm sure most of you are aware of the fact that Zimbabwe recently went through a hyperinflation where it got so bad at the height of it. It was in I think like the late 2008 period, where their prices were rising so fast they were doubling every 23 hours. Okay, so let me say the price level in Zimbabwe would double in less than a day. Right, so if gasoline cost $100 a gallon in the morning, it would cost $200 before the next morning. That's the rate at which prices were increasing. So the annualized rate was over 1 billion% at the peak of the Zimbabwe inflation. All right, so that's just astronomical. It was far worse than what happened to Germany in between the two world wars, where you've got the anecdotes of people pushing around wheelbarrows full of cash and so forth. Okay, so that just shows you the dangers of having a fiat money. The word fiat there meaning just because of the authority of the government. Like they just say this is the money, and that's what the money is. There's nothing backing it up, as opposed to commodity money. So this goes back to the point I made before, that historically money was produced by the marketplace. Just like people made TVs and so forth, private businesses and individuals created the money. That first of all, people settled on things like gold and silver as the money that the marketplace used, and then even private businesses, private mints, would create coins. They would take gold and silver and so forth and then turn them into coins that people could use. And that was done in the private sector. Okay, so that's not, nowadays we tend to just associate money with the state and think that has to be produced by the government, because where would the money come from if the government didn't make it? But historically that's not how it happened. All right. So and then in the process of getting into the current situation where everybody around the world and all major countries uses what's called fiat money, that transition itself took centuries. And what happened is, originally the governments would suppress the issue of paper notes by private institutions, by banks and so forth, so that it was just one note that people in a certain region used. But the reason they used it and trusted it was because the government would back it up with gold or silver or some other precious commodity. And so originally the reason Americans used green pieces of paper with pictures of dead presidents on them is that those things entitled you, they were a legal claim entitling you to a specific weight of silver or gold, depending on the time period. All right, so just for example, for a long time, up until the year 1933, if you had $20.67 in U.S. currency, then the government was obligated to give you 1 ounce of gold. Okay, and that just gives you an idea of how far prices have risen since then. That back before, in the early 1900s, the price of 1 ounce of gold was only $20.67, whereas now, it's over $1,500 an ounce. Okay, so so that was part of that. And again, we don't have time to get into the whole details of that, but part of the whole rationale of the gold standard is a check upon the government's ability to print money. Right, just like you could have a constitution that limits the powers of government. The classical liberals, the people who were sort of like the advocates of laissez-faire free markets back then, they generally embraced the gold standard because they thought it was a limit on the power of the government. That you didn't want to give a printing press over to the politicians. That seemed like a bad idea, and so the way you limited their discretion is you said, yeah, okay, you guys have managed to take over the business of manufacturing money from the private sector. You've now monopolized that, so now that's considered by everyone a government function, is to create money. But the way we're gonna insist that you don't have just absolute authority. You can't just print those things and spend them however you want. We have the right as citizens to take those pieces of paper you're printing and exchange them for actual gold or silver, right? And so that was a limit on how much they could print, because if they printed too many of those pieces of paper, then people would turn too many of those in and they'd run out of their gold and silver holdings, right? Because the government can't print gold. It has to, acquire it from gold miners and so forth. Okay, so that was the function of the gold standard in terms of the political ideologies, or in terms of the limited government. That was the function of it. It kept a check on how much paper money governments could create. So of course with Zimbabwe and their $100 trillion notes, there was no formal check on them. They just kept printing money. Their bills kept going up because prices kept going up, so they just kept printing more and more money, and it just blew up in their face. Okay, so just a few notes on this, because again we have a short time frame here. I want to have time for your questions. A lot of times nowadays when people talk about the gold standard, if you read about it in a history book, or even if you hear people talking about it now in terms of financial pundits or so forth, because a lot of the people in the Tea Party movement are touting gold again, and they're railing against fiat money. So a lot of the so-called sophisticates just explain matter-of-factly, well, no, there was lots of problems with the gold standard, and that's why we left the gold standard in 1933. And I just want to clarify here, it's not like, that's not analogous to saying, oh, we in the United States no longer speak English the same way that Shakespeare did, or the people in Shakespeare's time did, right? So it's not like we left the gold standard and that was just sort of a spontaneous decision and everybody just naturally stopped using it. No, what happened in 1933, FDR comes into office, and one of his first acts is to was to end the gold standard, was to close the gold window. To what he did, among other things, is he said, okay, all American citizens have to turn over their gold to the government, and we'll give you in exchange $20.67 of currency. So in his mind, we're not stealing it from you, we're just making you exchange one asset for something of comparable value. All right, and this wasn't like he didn't ask them. You got, I think it was up to a 10-year prison sentence or a $10,000 fine if you didn't do it. And there were some exceptions, like if you were collecting gold of coins with numismatic value, they were collector's items or something, you could keep that. But in terms of gold that you were just using as money, no, you had to turn over the government, because the government wanted to solidify its authority in the monetary sphere, and it didn't. The gold standard was a limit, was a constraint or handcuffs on what it could do, and so they were step by step weaning the public off of the gold standard. And so this picture here, this isn't the Pentagon, this is actually Fort Knox, and that is, I think everybody knows nowadays. Oh yeah, Fort Knox is a big gold depository. But what a lot of people don't know is the reason they had to build the gold depository at Fort Knox, which was a military base, is FDR seized all the Americans' gold and they had to put it somewhere. So that's actually why they had to build that, is because the government seized everybody's gold and they wanted to put it somewhere safe. So that's where Fort Knox comes from. Just to show you something else here. This, I don't know how well you can see it because it's kind of small on my screen. This is the Consumer Price Index going back to, I think, 1913 is where this chart starts. So this is just showing the level of prices, like milk, bread, eggs, and so forth. They take an average of that and come up with an index for how high what the cost of living is, if you will. So you can see for a long time it's fairly flat, and it starts rising in World War II and then going up more. But then in the early 1970s, it just takes off like a rocket. You say, well, what is it that happened in the early 1970s? Well, that's when, after FDR sort of took the gold standard away from American citizens, he still allowed central banks around the world to exchange their dollars for gold. All right, they changed the price to $35 an ounce, up from $20.67. Okay, so after World War II, there was what was called the Bretton Woods system, where most major nations around the world, they use dollars as sort of like their reserve. So instead of using gold, they all use dollar bills. But the way the United States kept them comfortable with that was the United States said, we're not doing this with our own citizens anymore. We're not letting them turn in dollars for gold. but you central bankers, you other major governments, to get you to be comfortable using the dollar in your system and having that be as a foundation for your currencies. We promise if you ever don't want your dollars, we'll redeem them. You can give us $35 and we'll give you an ounce of gold. Okay, so that Bretton Woods system was the one that was in place after World War II. And then in 1971, Richard Nixon even ended that. So from 1971 on, nobody on planet Earth could turn in dollar bills for gold anymore. So that was the official total closing of the gold window, was in 1971. And so it's not a coincidence that that's when inflation really took off in the United States. And of course, we all know that by the late 1970s, that was one of the worst peacetime periods of price inflation that most modern Americans remember. So again, that wasn't just some bolt of the blue that hit us for no good reason, or it wasn't simply because those Arab nations are got us over a barrel and they're not pumping enough oil. No, it was because that was when the government finally had the last constraint on its money printing removed, and so it's not surprising that they started cranking out dollar bills at that point, because they had to, the Vietnam War was still in effect there. They were paying for the Great Society programs and so on, so the government had a lot of big bills, and it one of the ways that it could now do it was indirectly financing that through the printing press. Okay, so I've already talked about this. The danger of government inflation, of course, is that when you remove the checks provided by a gold standard, then it's just up to the discretion of the people running the printing press. So, of course, most major nations we hope are going to be more responsible than they were in Zimbabwe, but the point is, there is that danger there, and that's why so many people are worried about Ben Bernanke's policies over the last few years. I mean, obviously he hasn't done what the Zimbabwe Central Bank did, but the point is still that, for those of you familiar with it, he's expanded certain measures of the money supply a lot in the last 2 years, even more so than they did during the Depression, right? So a lot of people are concerned that if things start going back to normal, if Bernanke doesn't suck all that money out of the financial sector, it's going to, start pushing up prices across the board. And of course, we already do see a lot of prices rising. Okay, why don't I jump ahead here, since we're running low on time, to the myths of the Great Depression. So again, my perspective is as a free market economist, so I wrote that book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. And so a lot of this stuff, I call it revisionist history, but only because, in the sense that it's totally counter. A lot of stuff I discovered and I talk about in the book is totally contrary to what I learned growing up in terms of American history from this period. But it's not like I had to go to real obscure sources and dig up, controversial historians and quote things that differ from what other people say. No, I just, the sources I cite in my book are just standard government figures, like looking at the government budget and things like that, right? So these are looking at the official unemployment figures. So it's not that I am relying on an alternate set of facts, it's that I'm looking at the same facts, but from the perspective of free market economic theory and saying, wait a minute, the official story doesn't make any sense. How do you explain this, this, and this? Okay, so why don't we just go through it? I'll give you some of the highlights of that.